Hello students, this is a class for BA Part 3 English Literature students. We will be doing a poem by W.H. Auden, and the title of the poem is In Memory of W.B. Yeats. I am Dr. Anil Dadij. The poem is actually an elegy and it is written in the nature of an obituary. It is an evaluation of the poet as well as an elegy also, and in the final part of the poem it becomes a prayer also. And if we talk about the tone of the poem, it is anti hyperbolic. There is no attempt of exaggeration for the subject, or that is to say W.B. Yeats in the poem. W.B. Yeats was an Irish poet. He was a major symbolist poet who won Nobel Prize for Literature, and he died in January 1939 in France at the age of 74. W.H. Auden was also a leading poet of England in 30s, along with Stephen Spender and C.D. Lewis. Later on, he moved to America. His early poetry was Marxist in nature, but later on he became strong Christian and his tone became conservative. It may sound paradoxical, but yet he gave a sense of commitment in his poetry. He was actually a professor of poetry at Oxford from 1956 to 1961. The poem is an expression of his innermost feelings, and if we talk about the time of writing this poem, it was full of uncertainty as the world was on the brink of another world war, that is to say, Second World War, and it was winter season, very symbolic at the time of his death. Let us read the poem. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The poet, of course, talks about W.B. Yeats. He disappeared means he died in the dead of winter. It was the winter season. The brooks were frozen. The airports were almost deserted. Why? He gives you a picturesque scene of winter season, of the January season in France. The brooks were almost frozen, and there were no passengers on the airports. They were almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. In France, you know there are so many statues, public statues of big leaders, and they were disfigured because they were covered with snow. It was a heavy snowfall at that time. The mercury, that is to say the sun, sank in the mouth of the dying day. Means there was no sunlight in the day, and it was the time of evening, the dying of the day, in which mercury sank, that is to say the sun sank. Oh, all the instruments agree. Whatever instrument with which you can check the season, all the instruments agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. On surface level, you can say it was a January evening, and it was very cold, and things were everywhere. You feel it was frozen, but on the other hand, you can feel the cold atmosphere of the world, where the world was almost on the brink of World War II. Far from his illness, far from his illness, the waltz ran on through the evergreen forests. He is talking about nature, but indirectly you can feel the symbolism. The wolves are symbol of violent forces. They ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant rivers peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quage, unstoppable, moving by morning tongues. They were not affected. The river, the Walsh, far from this place of his death, they were unaffected. They were unaffected by mourning tongues. Mourning means lamenting, expressing sorrow over the death of the poet. So, by mourning tongues, by lamenting tongues, the nature was unaffected, he wants to say. The death of the poet was kept from his poems. The death of the poet was kept from his poem. Means the poet was dead, but his poems survived him. But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself. As a person, as a human being, as an entity, it was his last afternoon. An afternoon of nurses and rumors. If he could see, if he could feel around, nurses were around him, and there were rumors of his death or his survival. There were rumors all around spread. The provinces of his body revolted. Provinces means areas. Areas of his bodies means you can say the mind, the heart, the kidney, the liver. There are so many organs, and these organs may be called as the provinces of his body. They revolted. They revolted means just as against an empire, when the provinces revolt, it becomes a very difficult situation. It almost becomes a civil war type situation. And in, same happened with the poet. His body organs revolted against him. Uh, his kidney, his heart, his blood pressure, all shooted. The squares of his mind were empty. That is to say, he was unconscious. He fell unconscious because the provinces of his body revolted. Silence. Silence invaded. Invade means attack and win. So silence invaded, attacked upon the suburbs. Means on his mind, on his body, on his consciousness, silence pervaded. The current of his feeling failed. He was not able to feel anything. He became his admirers. Ultimately, finally, he became his admirers means in whatever way his admirers saw him, he became that. Means in whatever way they interpreted him, in whatever way they appreciated or criticized him, he became that. He had no more the knack to answer. He had no more life to answer what his admirers said about him. Now he is scattered among 100 cities. His poetry is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. Unfamiliar people and their affection, in what way they would take up his poetry, nobody can tell. Wholly given over to unfamiliar affections of the people of 100 cities in the world, to find his happiness in another kind of wood. He left this world to find his happiness in another kind of wood. Wood means forest, and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. And if he were to be punished, if ever he would be criticized, it would be against the foreign code of conscience. Maybe in a foreign land where the code of conscience is different, where people follow different code of conscience, it is quite possible that his values, whatever values he held in his poetry, may be different, and therefore people may criticize him, and that will be the punishment, you can say. So he will be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living, because the dead man is no more there to answer, to clarify, to speak against whatever is said about him. So they are the words of the dead man. Whatever he has said, and he is not there to support himself, So such words are modified in the guts of the living. The living people change their meanings, and he cannot do anything. That is what the poet wants to convey. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, and now he gives you a picture of the busy day when he died. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, people are worried, people are conscious of tomorrow, of future. And in the importance of that, living people have their own tenure, living people have their own way of life. So they think of future, they think of tomorrow, and in that noise, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of Bourse. Bourse is actually the stock market in Paris. In Paris, so the brokers are compared with beasts, animals, and they are roaring, and they roar for their benefits. So uh, on the floor of the bourse, on the floor of the stock market, brokers are roaring, unaware that the great poet is no more. The poor have their sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed. And on the other hand, there is one more class, that of poor, and they have their own suffering. So they were also unaffected by the death of the poet, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. And the interesting thing is this, that whether a person is poor or super rich, they in their own cell of himself, cell means prison, each in the prison of himself, everybody is chained, everybody lives in a prison, but they think that they are free. They live a free life. So they are convinced of their freedom, although we do not have the freedom, just as the poet died. He wanted to live, but he could not do anything to live. So each in the cell of himself, in each, everyone is imprisoned in his own prison, but everyone lives with a conviction, with a faith that he leads a free life. A few thousand will think of this day. And apart from these poor and rich people, a few thousand people who may be the admirers of this poet, W.B. Yeats, a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. And what was this slightly unusual thing that they did? It was actually lamentation over the death of the poet. They remembered that their favorite poet is no more, he died. So they will remember this day in this manner. Oh, all the instruments agree. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. This is the first part of the poem. We will study the second and third part tomorrow. Thank you.